Welcome to the Lost Sci-Fi Story channel. If you're ready, let's begin today's story.
The shuttle broke through the cloud layer at 600 local time, and Marcus Vale got his first honest look at the world he'd signed 6 months of his life over to. And his first honest thought was that someone in the assignment office owed him an apology. Brown. The planet was brown in the specific, committed way of a world that had considered other colors and rejected them on philosophical grounds. Not the warm brown of good topsoil, not the rich dark brown of earth that has been worked and fed and composted into productivity. This was the pale, exhausted brown of soil that had been making do without adequate mineral support for longer than anyone had been keeping records, and it stretched in every direction with the quiet confidence of something that didn't expect to be argued with. He pressed his forehead against the shuttle porthole and watched the colony settlement resolve out of the haze below. A cluster of pale geometric structures arranged on the surface of the planet with the tentative optimism of a first attempt, connected by pathways that looked, from altitude, like someone had drawn lines between the buildings with a slightly uncertain hand. The agricultural zones were visible as darker patches around the settlement's edge, and even from this height Marcus could read the soil's reluctance in the way the crops grew, technically alive, performing the minimum biological requirements for continued existence, but without the density and color that indicated a system genuinely working. He had seen that look on fields before. It meant the ground was tired, and nobody had yet figured out how to listen to it properly. His translation app chirped softly against his wrist as the shuttle began its descent, reminding him that it had downloaded the updated Sarathi linguistic package during transit, and that its accuracy rating for standard conversational exchange was currently 91%, with a footnote indicating that idiomatic and ceremonial language remained a work in progress. Marcus had learned, over 9 years and 11 worlds of contract agricultural work, that a translation app's footnotes were where the real information lived. He read the footnote twice, thought about the elder on Cavani's III whose formal greeting had been rendered by a 93% accurate app as "you smell like a productive morning," and decided to smile carefully at everyone until he had a better feel for the situation. The landing pad was a flat expanse of compacted earth surrounded by low structures, and 3 Sarathi were waiting beside it with the composed stillness of people who had decided to be patient, and were executing that decision with great discipline. They were tall, a full head taller than Marcus, who was not short and bipedal, and arranged in the bilateral symmetry that the universe seemed to consider a reasonable solution to the problem of moving a body through space. At first glance, they looked almost human enough to make the small differences feel strange, rather than simply foreign. The skin of the one nearest him held a faint iridescence that shifted between bronze and a deep muted green as he moved, and along his temples ran lines of faintly raised patterning, like the tracework of frost on glass, that Marcus recognized from the briefing materials as Vethara, sensory filaments that Sarathi used to read environmental data through direct contact, which meant they were, in practical terms, walking soil analysis equipment. This fact alone made Marcus feel that the assignment had been designed specifically to humble him, and he respected that. The eldest of the 3 wore a translation collar, a polished bronze ring that sat against his throat, and converted the layered harmonic speech of the Sarathi into English with a particular earnestness that produced correct sentences at a slight philosophical remove from ordinary conversation. He welcomed Marcus to Sarath IV and said that his quarters were prepared, and that the soil analysis teams would be available in the morning, and that his primary student had been selected with considerable care, and that the colony was honored to receive the benefit of his expertise. The collar rendered expertise with a resonance that made it sound briefly like a sacred object, and Marcus thanked him and meant it, and only later, lying in his prepared quarters listening to the alien dark outside, did he allow himself to register that the man had said nothing at all about whether the soil was workable. In Marcus's experience, people mentioned the things they were confident about. The things they didn't mention were the ones that had been keeping them up at night. He slept adequately. In the morning, he drank the closest local equivalent to coffee, which was a hot beverage that tasted like ambition with undertones of regret, and gathered his field kit and walked out to the first test plot under a sky the color of pale chalk. And that was where he found her, standing in the middle of the field already, holding a soil core sample at eye level, and regarding it with the focused disapproval of someone who had asked a simple question and received a complicated and unsatisfactory answer. She lowered it when she heard him approach, and turned, and looked at him with eyes the color of deep amber set wide in a face that was nearly human and entirely its own thing, and said, in English that was deliberate and precise and clearly built word by word from scratch, that she was Sale, that she expected him to teach her everything he knew without omission, and that she would not pretend to understand something she did not simply to avoid inconvenience. Then she held out the soil core for him to examine, as though the introduction was complete and there was no reason to spend further time on it when the ground was right there with its problems waiting. Marcus took the sample. It was, as he'd suspected from altitude, deeply depleted. He turned it in his hands and thought about the 9 years and 11 worlds, and all the tired soil he'd ever stood over and asked to do better, and looked at the woman across from him who had just described the ideal working relationship in 2 sentences, and felt something settle in his chest that wasn't quite professional satisfaction, but was adjacent to it, in the way that certain things start as one thing and take their time becoming another. He told her the soil was going to require some convincing. She said she was familiar with that. They got to work. The first real argument happened on a Wednesday over nitrogen. This was, in Marcus's experience, a perfectly reasonable thing to argue about. Nitrogen was the element that determined whether a crop reached its potential or spent its entire growing cycle making apologetic gestures toward it. And the Sarathi soil's relationship with nitrogen was complicated in the specific way of a long-standing disagreement where both parties had forgotten what started it. Marcus wanted to introduce a legume rotation system, standard practice, proven across dozens of worlds, the kind of solution that worked because it worked with biology rather than trying to override it. Sale listened to the entire explanation with the attentive stillness she brought to everything, and then told him in her careful, deliberate English that they had tried legumes, that legumes had their own opinion about Sarathi soil chemistry, and that this opinion was best described as hostile. She said this without drama, the way someone states a fact that the universe has already confirmed and doesn't require further debate. Marcus said the problem was probably the soil pH, not the legumes. Sale said the problem was the legumes. They stood across a test furrow from each other in the pale Sarathi morning, and had the kind of professional disagreement that is entirely about the science, and only slightly about the fact that neither of them was accustomed to being wrong. They ran the test. The legumes, it turned out, had a great deal to say about Sarathi soil chemistry, and none of it was constructive. Marcus stood over the struggling seedlings 4 days later with the soil analysis data on his handheld scanner, and the quiet dignity of a man recalibrating his position. And Sale crouched beside the test row and touched the earth with her Vethara-lined fingers and said nothing, which was considerably more eloquent than saying something. He told her she'd been right. She said she was aware. He asked how she'd known without running the analysis first, and she pressed her palm flat against the soil and said the ground had told her approximately 2 minutes after the seeds went in, and that she had been waiting to see how long it took his instruments to agree. Her instruments, she said, were older. After that, Marcus stopped treating her Vethara as a curiosity and started treating them as data. This was the right decision professionally, and also an interesting one personally, because it required him to update his understanding of what it meant to read a field. Sale didn't just walk through a plot and observe it. She moved through it the way a physician moves through an examination, her hands occasionally dropping to the soil surface with the brief focused contact of someone taking a pulse. And the information she gathered came back through her face, in the form of small shifts he was learning to read. Her Vithara flushed faintly gold when she found something unexpected. They went a muted gray-green when the news was bad, when the soil was genuinely healthy, when one of their amended test plots showed real improvement in mineral uptake. They did something she clearly didn't fully control, a rapid brightening that started at the temples and traveled in a warm wave across the backs of her hands. And the first time Marcus saw it happen, he said nothing because she looked briefly, unguardedly pleased, and it seemed like the kind of moment that commenting on would only diminish. The irrigation system took most of the third week and produced the most reliable comedy of the entire assignment. The colony's existing water infrastructure had been designed according to Sarathi engineering principles, which were thorough and beautiful, and not especially concerned with the particular hydraulic requirements of earth crop varieties. Marcus spent 3 days with schematics and a junior infrastructure technician named Vel, who had the permanent expression of someone who has been asked to explain something for the 4th time and is considering his options. And together, they redesigned the distribution network for the eastern test fields. The installation went well. The inaugural test run went less well. A connector joint Marcus had marked as requiring replacement, and then failed to replace, because Vel had assured him it was rated for the pressure, parted company with the main line at the precise moment of maximum flow. And Marcus received the majority of the resulting redistribution of the colony's irrigation water personally, from approximately the waist down, while standing in a field that remained conspicuously dry. He stood in the spreading puddle of the situation and assessed it briefly and told Sale, who was watching from a distance with those wide amber eyes, that this method was also technically a form of targeted water application, just less efficient, and that they should note it in the records as an alternative approach. She looked at him for 3 full seconds. Then she made a sound from deep in her chest that was layered and harmonic and completely real, and her Vithara went brilliant gold from temple to fingertip, and Marcus went to change his clothes with the private and significant feeling of a man who has just been given something he didn't know he was waiting for. It was around this time that Vel's translation collar began to develop a personality. This was not supposed to happen. The collars were functional devices, not adaptive systems, but Vel had been running his through a third-party modification that he claimed improved idiomatic flexibility, and that in practice produced occasional sentences that had the right grammatical structure and entirely wrong freight. Marcus asked Vel one afternoon whether the amended soil conditioner was ready, and Vel's collar rendered his response as, "The future remembers us warmly, and the mixture is prepared." Marcus wrote this down in his field journal under the heading of things that are technically correct, and kept it there for the rest of the assignment, because he found, over the following weeks, that it applied to more situations than expected. Sale read it once over his shoulder and asked what it meant. He said he wasn't entirely sure. She considered it for a moment and said it was how her grandmother had spoken about planting season. He looked at her. She returned her attention to the phosphorus readings with the serenity of someone who has said the true thing and doesn't require a response to it. The days built on each other the way soil builds, each one adding something small that isn't visible yet but changes what grows later. Marcus had done this work long enough to know the rhythm of a good assignment. The early weeks of assessment and planning, the middle weeks of implementation and problem-solving, the late weeks when the system started working and you could see the shape of what you'd actually built. What he had not accounted for, on any previous assignment, was the particular texture of working beside someone who improved everything they touched. Not loudly, not with any performance of competence, but with the quiet consistency of someone for whom good work was not an effort but a standard, and who held the people around her to it simply by being what she was. He noticed this and filed it professionally. He noticed it again the following week and filed it again. By the 5th week, he had accumulated a considerable internal filing cabinet of observations that were becoming difficult to categorize correctly. And he dealt with this the way he dealt with most things that resisted easy categorization, which was to put more energy into the work and trust that clarity would arrive in its own time. The soil, at least, was beginning to respond. The first amended plots were showing real yield improvement, a full 30% above baseline, and every morning when Marcus arrived at the field sale was already there, already working, her hands in the earth, reading what it had to say. He started arriving earlier. The field was worth it. He told himself this was about the field. The yield reports came back on a Tuesday, and for approximately 4 minutes the eastern test field produced the best morning Marcus had experienced on any world in 9 years of contract work. The numbers were real, not the cautious optimism of early-stage improvement, but actual, documentable yield increases across every amended plot, the kind of data that justified the methodology and the soil conditioning investment, and the 3 weeks of arguing with Sarathi Infrastructure about water pressure tolerances. He stood in the field with the scanner results and felt the particular satisfaction of a person whose theory has survived contact with reality, which is the best feeling available to people who work in the applied sciences, and looked across at Sale, who was reviewing the same data on her own handheld, with the focused composure of someone who has been expecting this result, and is pleased but not surprised, because she had touched this soil every day for 3 months, and the soil had been telling her it was coming. Then the council meeting happened, and the 4 minutes ended. The Agricultural Council of Sarath IV met in a long, low building near the settlement center that smelled of mineral dust and institutional patience, and they received Marcus's progress report with the kind of attentive gravity that made him feel, briefly, that his work mattered enormously. Before the eldest council member asked whether the earth crop varieties could be modified to grow faster, because the colony's resource projections had been recalculated, and the timeline for food self-sufficiency had been shortened by 18 months. Marcus explained, as he had explained to various governing bodies on various worlds across a decade, that crop varieties did not operate on institutional timelines. The elder's translation collar rendered Marcus's explanation as a series of technically accurate sentences delivered with the resigned eloquence of a man who had said the same thing many times on many planets, and the council nodded with the thoughtful expression of people who had heard it and were going to ask again in a slightly different way. Sale, sitting beside Marcus as his lead student and field supervisor, said something in Sarathi that the room received with more deference than his entire report had generated, and the meeting concluded shortly afterward with an outcome Marcus would have called a compromise and Sale called a delay, which was a distinction she explained to him on the walk back to the field, by saying that a compromise suggested both parties had moved, whereas what had actually occurred was that the council had agreed to wait, while science continued to be science, whether or not the council found this convenient. He told her that was the most accurate summary of agricultural policy he'd ever heard. She said it was also the most accurate summary of her family, but she preferred when the context was professional. It was the first time she had mentioned her personal life in any direct way, and it was said and passed over with the speed of something mentioned in transit rather than offered for discussion. And Marcus let it go because the field had opinions about the afternoon light and they both had work to do. But it sat in the back of his attention the way small things do when they are actually large things in compact form, and he noticed it still there when he arrived at the field the following morning and found her examining the modified wheat rows with her vethara, faintly gray-green at the temples, which meant something was wrong before she said a word. What was wrong was Vel's irrigation modification to the northern sector, which had developed a pressure variance overnight that nobody had caught because The monitoring system's alert threshold had been calibrated to Sarathi crop requirements rather than Earth variety requirements, and the modified wheat had received approximately 40% less water than it needed during the night cycle. The damage was recoverable but required immediate intervention, and Marcus and Sale spent 4 hours in the northern sector, running emergency supplemental irrigation with handheld equipment, while Vel stood at the field's edge and delivered updates in a collar that rendered his apologetic explanation as, "The system had private reasons, which are now resolved." Marcus, on his knees with a manual irrigation rod in dry soil, said nothing because he was being professional. Sale, beside him, said something in Sarathi that was clearly not professional at all, and the Sarathi technician who was working 3 rows over made a sound that suggested he had understood it perfectly and agreed entirely. By early afternoon, the wheat was recovering, and Marcus's knees were registering a formal complaint, and they ate their midday meal sitting on the edge of the water collection basin, Sale's design, built in the 6th week after 2 weeks of argument, which had turned out to be better than his original proposal. She had told him, when he showed her the documentation, that most people she worked with did not record being wrong. He said he'd found it was the most useful data available. She had looked at him, then with the wide amber consideration she brought to things she was deciding how to categorize, and said nothing, which he was learning was her response to things she found genuinely surprising. She asked him that afternoon, between bites of something that the Colony Food Service described as a grain cake, and that tasted like a grain cake that had studied the concept academically, whether he had a family council. He said humans had families but not councils in the technical sense, that nobody had formal authority over who he partnered with or what those partnerships were supposed to produce in terms of community benefit or genetic compatibility. She was quiet for a moment. She asked how humans decided then. He said it varied considerably, and that the process was neither reliable nor efficient, and that it frequently produced outcomes that made no rational sense, and that this was somehow considered acceptable and even desirable as a feature of the system. She looked out across the water basin and said, with the careful precision she used when she was working something out in real time, that it sounded unstable. He said it was. She said, almost to herself, almost not to anyone, that she had assumed instability was always the problem. He looked at her profile against the pale Sarathi sky and thought, with the involuntary honesty that arrives when you're tired and your knees hurt, and you've been in the sun for 4 hours, that some instabilities were load-bearing, that certain things only grew because they were allowed to move in directions nobody had pre-approved. He did not say this out loud. He finished his grain cake, which did not improve on reflection, and stood up and said the afternoon plots needed checking, and she stood up and said she knew, and they went back to the work, which was always there, which was the reliable thing, which was the thing he was increasingly using as a substitute for the conversation he was not having, and which was becoming, despite his best efforts, insufficient. The transit shuttle was scheduled for 800, and Marcus had been awake since 400, which meant he had spent 4 hours in the particular company of a man who has run out of ways to avoid his own conclusions. He had packed the moisture-sealed crates the night before with the methodical focus of someone who believes that if you organize the external world thoroughly enough, the internal one will follow out of courtesy. It had not followed. The crates were immaculate. He was a disaster. He checked the Eastern field data one final time on his scanner Habit, or something wearing Habit as a disguise, and the numbers were still real, still documented, still the best yield improvement recorded on Sarath IV in 11 years of attempted agricultural development. The amended soil was holding. The water basin was functioning at 104% of projected efficiency, which was Sale's design still outperforming his estimates the way it had from the first week of operation. The modified wheat rows would produce a full harvest in 6 more weeks without him, because he had done his job, because Sale had learned everything he had to teach and several things he hadn't, because the work was complete in the way that justified departure and made it feel, simultaneously, like something being broken rather than finished. He set the scanner down on top of the larger crate and sat on the smaller one and thought, with the clarity available only to people who have exhausted all their deflections, that he was going to leave in 4 hours, and the thing he was leaving was not a field. Vell's caller found him at 600 with a farewell message from the infrastructure team that the caller rendered as, "Your water has become our water, and this is the highest thing." Marcus read it twice and decided it was the most genuinely moving sentence the caller had ever produced, either intentionally or by accident, and that he would keep it in the field journal alongside the entry about the future remembering them warmly, and that together they constituted an accidental philosophy of development work that was better than anything the assignment office had put in his official briefing materials. He wrote it down carefully. He had 4 hours. The writing took 3 minutes, and the remaining time reassembled itself in front of him with the unhelpful abundance of time that has nowhere to go. She knocked at 6:30. The 2-beat Sarathi knock, back of the knuckle, the one that had taken him 6 weeks to identify correctly, and that he would now, he realized in the moment of hearing it, recognize for the rest of his life on any door on any world. He opened the door and Sale was standing in the early pale light of a Sarathi morning wearing her field jacket, her hair lifting slightly at the crown in the pressure-reading way that had nothing to do with weather. And she was looking at him with the expression she used when she had already solved the problem, and was now in the harder work of explaining the solution to someone who needed to catch up. She said she had never asked anyone the question she was about to ask. She said this first, before the question, because she wanted him to understand what it meant that she was standing here at all. Marcus leaned against the doorframe and listened with his full attention and the stillness of a man who has learned, in 6 months of working beside this particular person, that when she is preparing to say something true, she requires the space to finish the architecture of it before anyone responds. She said her people did not ask this question because the question did not exist for them in any functional sense. Partnerships were assigned. Individual preference was a variable. The system had eliminated the way you eliminated a reactive compound from a soil mixture, not because it had no value, but because uncontrolled variables compromised the stability of everything around them. And stability was what a colony in a difficult environment needed more than it needed anything else, including the things that individual people might, in private, consider necessary. She had understood this her entire life. She had accepted the partner her family council had selected 7 years ago with the same practical composure she brought to every other condition of her existence, because there was no framework in her culture for doing otherwise. You did not choose. Choosing was not a mechanism the system offered. Marcus had given her a framework, she said, not deliberately, not as a lesson with a heading and a set of field notes, but because he had spent 6 months teaching her that the best results did not come from imposing predetermined systems onto conditions that had their own nature, that the work was always to read what was actually there and respond to it honestly, even when what was there was inconvenient, even when it didn't match the plan, even when it required you to set down the methodology you'd arrived with and build something new from what the ground was actually offering. She had found this principle, she said, to be applicable beyond agriculture. She had found it to be applicable to most things. She had found it to be applicable to her. Therefore, she said, she needed to know what a human woman would do, what the human procedure was, whether permissions were required or documentation or a formal request to any council or governing body, because she had chosen. She understood that this word meant something different in her culture than in his. In hers, it was an act of structural defiance. In his, it was simply the ordinary thing people did. But she was choosing in the full weight of both meanings simultaneously, and she was choosing him, and she needed him to teach her, as he had taught her everything else, exactly what she was supposed to do about it. Her Vethara had flushed gold from temple to fingertip. She held his gaze with the amber steadiness she brought to every problem she had decided to solve. The morning was very quiet around them. Sarath IV's pale sun was clearing the low buildings of the settlement and putting long shadows across the pathway outside his door, and somewhere in the direction of the eastern field, his field, the modified wheat was standing in the early light doing the uncomplicated work of growing in soil that had finally been understood. Marcus looked at her and thought about 9 years and 11 worlds, and all the careful professional distance he had maintained across every one of them, all the filing and the deflecting and the not saying. He thought about the soil core on the first morning, and the nitrogen argument and the irrigation disaster, and the grain cakes that tasted like theoretical food, and Vel's collar producing accidental philosophy. And every morning for 6 months, arriving at a field where she was already there with her hands in the earth, and the early light on her Vethara, and the quiet total competence of someone who had decided what she was for. He thought about the water basin that outperformed his estimates. He thought about the framework he had given her without meaning to, and what it meant that she had used it to arrive here, at his door, at 6:30, asking what she was supposed to do. He told her the protocol was simple: no counsel, no documentation, no permissions required from any governing body on any world he was aware of. He told her the first step was that you told the person, and he crossed the threshold between them while she watched him with those wide amber eyes, and he told her. The full version, the unabbreviated edition that he had been filing under not applicable for 3 months, and that turned out, in the open air of an honest morning, to be entirely applicable and always had been. Sale was quiet for a moment after he finished. Her Vethara were doing the rapid warm brightening he had first seen over a successful soil test, the one she couldn't quite control, and she said, in the lower harmonics that his translation app declined to cover and that he understood anyway, that she had one more question. She asked whether the 2 weeks she would need to dismantle her family council's 7-year arrangement was within normal human parameters for this stage of the process, or whether he considered that a slow start. He laughed, which was the only possible response, and she joined him in that layered harmonic way that he had been collecting quietly since the first time he heard it, and the transit shuttle waited at its pad on the other side of the settlement, unconcerned, while 2 people stood in a doorway on a brown world that had turned out, under the right conditions, with the right attention and the right patience, and the willingness to read what was actually there, to be capable of growing almost anything. He sent a message to the assignment office, informing them that his departure would be delayed for reasons of agricultural continuity. This was not true, and they both knew it, and Sale pointed out that he had used the word agricultural where a more accurate word was available, and he said he was easing them into it. And she said she approved of this approach as a transitional methodology, and they walked together toward the eastern field because the wheat needed checking, and the morning was good, and the soil. When she pressed her palm flat against it 20 minutes later and her Vethara went bright and warm, had nothing left to say except that it was ready, and it was, and so were they.